For 6 decades, Prince Edward remained a peripheral figure in the royal story, a son rarely discussed by the public and reportedly pushed too hard by his father, Prince Philip. He was a young man who resigned from the Marines and never escaped the shadow of that choice, and later, the entrepreneur who watched his television production company dwindle to virtually nothing. Then, in 2025, something unexpected started to happen. King Charles began dispatching Edward to the United States repeatedly, first to Washington, D.C. in January, then to Newark in April, and to Philadelphia just days afterward. Each time he landed, Prince Harry was only a few miles away. This pattern raises 2 intriguing questions. What exactly is Charles asking his brother to do, and why is this occurring now? Edward arrived at 8:20 p.m. on March 10, 1964, at Buckingham Palace. One detail made his birth feel unique from the start. Prince Philip was actually there. In royal history, this stood out, as Edward was the only child of Queen Elizabeth II, whose father witnessed his birth. On the surface, this seems warm and personal, and it was. Yet that small moment sits beside a harder truth, because Philip later tried to push Edward toward the same tough, disciplined path he admired, even though Edward was never really built for that life. As the 4th and youngest child, he entered a family that already felt crowded. Charles was 16 and 13 and Andrew 4. So even as a prince, he arrived in a household where the main roles seemed already taken. The spotlight had settled on the older children, and the youngest grew up in the background, not because he did not matter, but because louder personalities had already filled the room. In a family built on rank, duty, and public attention, Edward became the one people could overlook without even meaning to. That quiet position shaped much of what followed. Like his siblings, he was sent to Gordonstown, the harsh Scottish boarding school that had also formed Prince Philip, King Charles, and Prince Andrew. The place had a brutal reputation, known for severe weather, strict discipline, and constant physical pressure. Charles once called it coldits and kilts, a line that stayed famous because it sounded funny while hiding something bitter underneath. For Edward, the deeper issue was not just the cold or the routine, but being forced into the same mold as his father and brother, despite being quieter, softer, and less forceful by nature. For a shy, royal child, such a place could feel less like school and more like survival. Later, he attended Jesus College, Cambridge, studying history from 1983 to 1986 and earning a Bachelor of Arts degree. On paper, this looked steady and respectable, and in some ways it was. But within royal life, the strange part was how little noise it made. His time at Cambridge did not become a national love story, a media frenzy, or a moment that reshaped the monarchy's image. It simply passed quietly. Even then, whispers persisted, as reports later noted that his A-level grades were not especially strong, yet he still gained admission. So even this stage carried that same feeling. He moved forward, but always with questions hanging over him. Then there was the title that seemed to take forever to arrive. Edward did not become Duke of Edinburgh until March 10, 2023, his 59th birthday, when King Charles III finally granted him the honor many had expected for years. The delay mattered because the title had been so closely bound to Prince Philip, who held it from 1947 until his death in 2021. After that, it passed briefly through Charles before being recreated for Edward. On paper, it fulfilled an old family promise, but emotionally, it felt like something else as well, a recognition that had come very late. At 59, Edward received the title people thought might have arrived much earlier, giving the moment a strange tone, an honor, yes, but also a correction long delayed. Then came the moment that pushed the whole affair over the edge. After the event, at the press conference, Edward asked journalists if they had enjoyed themselves. The room stayed quiet because the reporters had not even been allowed to watch the show. Edward snapped, "Well, thanks for sounding so bloody enthusiastic," before storming out. He also waved his finger at photographers and told them they would need to learn manners. That outburst became a story on its own, as royals are trained never to lose control like that in public. For a 23-year-old prince, it was a rare public meltdown, and it made the entire disaster look even worse. Over time, a royal knockout gained a reputation as one of the worst royal public relations mistakes ever. Commentators later described it as one of the biggest blunders in royal history because it shattered something essential. The royals were supposed to feel formal, distant, and controlled. That was part of the mystique. But this show turned them into costumed performers, replacing mystery with awkwardness. Even the money could not salvage the image. Reports said the event raised about £1.5 million to £1.63 million for charity. But that success could not erase what millions had just seen. The charities got the money. The monarchy lost some dignity. And Edward learned a hard lesson about what public attention can do when it turns the wrong way. After that, he seemed to search for another path, one that might finally be his own. In 1993, he founded Ardent Productions and tried to enter television and film as a genuine producer rather than just another prince doing ceremonial work. He even used the name Edward Windsor on business cards and presented himself as a television producer, not as a royal. It was a bold move because no child of a British monarch had attempted private entertainment work like that before. At first, the idea looked modern, perhaps even brave, suggesting he wanted to build something of his own. But that hope slowly ran into the same problem that kept appearing in his life. The work never fully escaped the shadow of his name. For nearly a decade, Ardent survived, but it never built the kind of strong, undeniable success that would silence critics. The company mostly produced documentaries, many of them linked to the royal family, which opened an awkward question. Was Edward getting work because he was talented or because he was royal? The more average the output seemed, the louder that question became. Reports indicated that Ardent struggled to land commissions, and critics mocked some of its programming as weak or outdated. Instead of proving himself, Edward looked trapped again between ambition and suspicion. The biggest damage came when Ardent sent a camera crew to film Prince William at St. Andrews University without permission from Buckingham Palace. That was not seen as a small mistake. Inside the family, it was treated as a serious breach of trust. The palace was furious, and Prince Charles was reportedly angry as well. In a business like Edward's, trust was everything, and once that cracked, the rest became very hard to save. His television career did not collapse in one dramatic second, but after that, the end felt close. Then, another scandal added pressure at exactly the wrong time. In 2001, Edward's wife, Sophie, was secretly recorded by a News of the World journalist pretending to be a client. On the tape, she made comments about politicians and the royal family, and the story exploded across the press. Edward was not the source of that scandal, but it still hurt him because by then, the couple's public image had become linked. The royal family was already uneasy about Edward's business direction, and now another wave of embarrassment hit the household, making a bad period worse. By March 2002, Edward stepped down from Ardent to focus on royal duties, and the company was later dissolved in June 2009. The end was especially painful because of how small and empty it looked. One report said investors had put in nearly £2.2 million and were left with almost nothing, with the company's assets down to just £40.27 at liquidation. That number became a symbol, not because it was huge, but because it was so tiny. The dream had not just failed, it had shrunk into almost nothing. All of this became even more important once King Charles's health created new pressure at the top. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that Charles had been diagnosed with cancer after a hospital procedure for an enlarged prostate. The palace did not name the exact cancer, which left a heavy silence hanging over the monarchy at a very uneasy moment. But even with that silence, one thing was obvious. The public face of the crown still had to keep moving. Events still had to be attended. Duties still had to be done. And Edward was one of the royals who kept showing up while the king cut back on public-facing work. That shift became very clear when Edward was sent to Washington for Jimmy Carter's funeral on January 9, 2025. By then he was 60 years old, traveling alone and handling the kind of visible overseas duty that usually goes to the most senior and most watched members of the family. He was not just attending a service. He was acting on behalf of the king in a room filled with global power. For someone who had spent years in the background, it was a sharp change in public meaning. Edward was no longer simply the quiet brother. He was becoming one of the monarchy's working answers to a time of strain. And strain was everywhere. Charles was dealing with cancer treatment. Catherine had been recovering from major surgery in 2024. Harry was in California, far from frontline royal life. Andrew remained damaged by scandal. Princess and had her own health concerns in 2024 and 2025. The family was stretched thin from several directions at once. In that environment, Edward and Sophie started to look even more important, not because they had suddenly changed, but because the monarchy needed stable adults who could work without bringing chaos with them. That is what makes Edward's rise feel so striking now. For years, he was often treated as the forgotten prince, the one who never quite fit. He left the Royal Marines. He had an uncomfortable television chapter. His film company drew criticism and eventually closed. The press spent a long time casting him as one of the less impressive Windsors. But now, the same man who once seemed easy to dismiss is one of the few royals trusted to stand on the world stage when the family cannot afford mistakes. That reversal gives his story real force. The prince people underestimated became the one the monarchy could quietly lean on. So when people speculate about whether Edward and Sophie could one day take on a more formal America-facing role, the idea does not sound as strange as it first appears. Nothing official says that is happening. It is still speculation, but it is not empty speculation. Edward already has an international network built through the Duke of Edinburgh's award, which operates across more than 120 countries and includes 61 national award authorities within the wider structure. He already has years of overseas work behind him, from Commonwealth events to award visits to diplomatic representation. And because the United States remains such an important soft power space for the monarchy, it is easy to imagine why royal watchers keep coming back to the same idea. If the crown ever needs a steady, low-drama, trusted figure for America-facing duties, Edward fits the shape of that role almost perfectly.